But more importantly, I knew the company had a very significant problem that could cut not just to one-day stock price trading, but could cut to the core of the company. It would have such a deleterious effect that it could theoretically wipe Revlon off the face of the counter in drugstores and department stores.
Most people believe that rabbits are voiceless. Wrong!
The demonstration featured a piece of street theater, and protesters dressed up in rabbit costumes brought along some live bunnies to help make their point.
Well, I think to be effective, you've got to be aware of the real world where it's at, and also you've got to be aware that you got to deal with people the way they are. You can't create people in a test tube. And basically, what gets a lot of us going is we put ourselves in the place of the animal. And if I were that animal, how would I want to be treated? And that's what puts the fire in our belly. But then we also have to think, if we want to change people's behavior, if I were that person, what would make me want to change my behavior? And calling them a bunch of sadistic bastards and clobbering with a 2x4 isn't going to make them sit up and say, how can we be responsive to these concerns?
I think there are a lot of people in the world who are trying to change it in some way for the better and are prepared to actually put some of their life into bringing about change. The problem always is, how can you, as an individual activist, really make a difference? The world is so vast, so complex. Sometimes you despair of making any kind of difference. I think the real lesson to be learned from what Henry has done is that you can make a difference.
Yeah, I've had an empathy for animals since I've been a kid. Early on, I remember having this daydream of breaking open all the bird cages and letting the birds soar free. And then later on, I remember my grandparents' home. They had this tongue hanging in the kitchen that totally grossed me out. I never ate tongue again. And I think it was just a whole series of events until somebody dumped a cat on me, and I became totally bonded with this cat. Then I became uncomfortable about caressing one animal and sticking a knife and fork into another. And around that time, around 1973, I came across Peter Singer's essay in the New York Review of Books, where he described a universe of billions of animals whose suffering was intense, expanding, and socially sanctioned. And I felt that what he was talking about is basically what I'd been into all along, basically in defense of the vulnerable, of the exploited, and the dominated. And the animals were on the bottom of the entire heap, and they were unable to mobilize in defense of their own interests, so it was up to us to do it for them.
In 1973, I was invited to take up a visiting assistant professorship at New York University. While I was doing that, I was asked to teach a course in continuing education for adults, not students of the university. And so I gave a series of classes developing the themes in animal liberation. And Henry SPIRA was one of the students who enrolled for that course. Over the years, I've worked with Henry and I've come to admire and respect the way he works, and we have become close friends.
At the end of the course, I said that we all know the way animals are being treated isn't right, and those of you who are interested in pursuing this, not from the point of view of philosophizing, but what is it that we can do about it, let's meet in my apartment. And then a group of about a half a dozen or 8 or 10 people met in my apartment for over an extended period of time. So we looked around and we went through computer searches and we looked through the literature and we found out about this American Museum of Natural History, where for a period of 20-some-odd years they've been deliberately crippling cats and kittens in order to then observe their sexual performance. The reason we thought this was a good campaign was because it was a sure winner. The museum has to be concerned with the image it projects. People don't expect this sort of thing to be happening at the museum. You're dealing with cats and kittens who are considered part of the household. In the summer of 1975, we started off with an article in Our Town, which is a New York City Manhattan weekly, and we had demonstrations every weekend for a year and a half, and it varied from half a dozen people to 1,000 people in a demonstration. And we had a lot of variety. We had fire trucks up there, we had celebrities out there, we had T-shirts, we had hats, we had posters. And one message that certainly came across the American Museum is that we weren't going to go away. We were going to stay up there until the experiments are stopped and until the labs are dismantled. And that's what we did. We just came down there every weekend for a year and a half.
Usually the scientific community rallies very strongly around any one of its members who's attacked by animal rights activists. But in this case, the support was rather weak. One reason was that this was an elderly scientist, and his experiments were kind of marginal significance. He was studying the effect on sexual performance when he did various things to cats. And he'd made a serious strategic error in that he had named his cats after various leaders of the scientific community, including one was named after the president of the National Academy of Sciences. This word had gotten around, so when he came under attack, the usual rallying round and defense didn't take place quite as strongly as it usually did.
We had asked our supporters to contact the media and tell them to tell the story of the museum. We'd asked them to contact the members of Congress, and one of the people that got really heavily involved in it was Congressman Ed Koch, who was then a congressperson from Manhattan.
I don't happen to like cats myself. I mean, I'm one of those people who has a phobia about cats, and I'm uncomfortable when I'm in the same room with them. You know, to each his own. I like dogs. So I went up to the museum. It was on a Saturday, and there in cages were perhaps 100 or more cats, each in a separate cage. So I said, well, tell me what you're doing. What are you experimenting on? And she said, well, we are experimenting on hyper and hyposexuality in cats. Hyper meaning too much sexual drive, hypo too little. I said, well, that's interesting. And I said, well, how do you pursue this experiment? She said, we put lesions in their brains in particular areas, and then we put the cat into a dark room. And in the dark room is a papier-mâché cat, a rabbit, female, and a female real live cat. And then what? Said I. And the person said, if the cat is hyper, it will mount the rabbit. So I was a little stunned by this. So I said, well, tell me something. I said, you take these cats and you put lesions in their brains, and after you have this deranged male cat with 2 holes in its brain, and you throw it into a dark room, and it mounts a rabbit? Yes. I said, well, how does the rabbit feel about this? And then I said, well, after you do this deranged cat in this dark room mounts the rabbit, what do you got? Silence. And then I said, how long have you been doing this? And she said, 20 years.
After Koch visited the museum and talked to the experimenters up there, he related his experiences to the members of Congress with a great deal of sarcasm and a great deal of wit, and that generated like a lot of support to stop these experiments. There was 121 members of Congress questioned the National Institutes of Health about what the hell was going on up there, and the result is that the pressure just kept on mounting and increasing, and then the National Institutes of Health stopped funding the experiment at the American Museum of Natural History, which caused them to stop the entire thing and dismantle the labs, and that was the end of that.
He not only mobilized considerable local activism, but he got the attention of the scientific community. I mean, the significant issue was Nicholas Wade's article in Science magazine that established that this was a protest with some legitimacy and some credibility.
I think Henry saw the article as a considerable vindication because the magazine I was working for was a sort of regarded as an organ of the scientific community. We reporters didn't regard it as that way. We tried to be as independent as we could. But from the outside, at least, it looked like we'd given our endorsement to Henry's side of the issue simply because we hadn't come out as strongly in favor of the scientists as he had expected.
When actually those experiments stopped, I thought this is a tremendous breakthrough for the whole idea of animal liberation, because now it's not going to be possible to dismiss the movement as a bunch of cranks or people who are just ineffective. Now people can see how pointless and cruel some of the experiments that are conducted on animals are, to the point that they're going to have a look at the whole question of how we treat animals in a different light. Well, scientists have been using animals to experiment on in order to discover things about the nature of our physiology for hundreds of years. But it was very, very small numbers. In the 19th century, in Britain, for example, they were doing about 400 experiments a year. In the 20th century, corporations began to use animals very standardly just to develop new products. They would put things into the eyes of rabbits, shampoos or other cosmetics. They would force feed rats and mice and dogs with any substance that might conceivably be ingested, whether it was a food colouring or a washing powder or whatever it was. So that in the United States, the numbers of animals being used each year rose into the tens of millions. Maybe 20, 30, 40 million animals were being used in testing. And this was an enormous amount of suffering that was going on. But the whole animal movement and the anti-vivisection movement seemed just powerless to do anything to stop these companies.
Yeah, what bothered me about the anti-vivisection movement was that basically all their activity consisted of collecting atrocity stories, sending these atrocity stories out to their members and their supporters, and asking them to send them money so that the following month they could send them more atrocity stories and ask them for more money, and the whole thing just didn't make any sense. The point isn't to get people upset about atrocities, but to get people fired up so that they do something about it, so that there's an end result that reduces the total amount of animal suffering. I was born in 1927 in Antwerp, Belgium, into a dysfunctional family. And when I was 9 years old, I was shipped out to live with some relatives. I lived in England, lived in Germany for a while. And then when I was 11, the family reunited in Panama. And when I was 13, I moved to New York. Well, my father, after a while, made out pretty well in New York in the industrial diamond business, and he became somewhat affluent and got a house out in Mount Vernon in the suburbs. He just felt that I needed to reflect his value systems, and it just didn't work. You know, I was reading leftist stuff, and he was trying to become affluent, and At the age of 16, I just left home. I just figured that I'm better off on my own. So I went to school in the morning, worked in the afternoon, supported myself, and then the following year when I was 17, I went on the merchant ships. Yeah, there was a whole bunch of reasons why I joined the merchant ships. One of them is just the adventure, wanting to see the world, wanting to see what's outside of where I've been. But also it was a hotbed of militant trade union activism, and I was interested in trade union activity. And it just seemed to me that it had all the elements of everything I wanted to do at that point. And I was footloose, and I wasn't grounded any place. And it was just the ideal thing to expand one's horizons.
Oh, I had a glowing dream of how fair the world would seem. Each man would live his life secure and free. When the world is owned by labor and there's truth and peace for all, in that commonwealth of toil that is to be, Alavai. Oh, God. Henry was pretty unique in the Socialist Workers' Party, where everybody was supposed to be quite disciplined. And Henry was never very disciplined at all. He did what he wanted to do, and was always in a good cause, and people would approve of it. But there were a lot of people who sort of took a dim view of that kind of behavior.
In 1951, the U.S. Coast Guard screened me off the ships because they felt that my continued presence would be inimical to the security of the United States government. And then I was drafted into the U.S. Army. I was shipped off to Berlin, and my job was to indoctrinate the American troops about the American way of life. And here you got the incongruity of one arm of the government considers me subversive, and the other one has me indoctrinating them. When I left the Army, I got a job at General Motors automobile assembly plant in Linden, New Jersey. And there was this Hungarian fellow who worked there, and he was real popular with his mates. And when there was a big problem up there, he just laid down his tools, got the rest of the people in the body shop to lay down their tools, and was able to close down the entire plant. And he didn't even attend trade union meetings because he figured they were beside the point. And it showed you the power of what one person can do who's in sync with the rest of the people.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Henry went to the South, as a matter of fact, and wrote articles about the civil rights movement as he saw it. He would go to the scene of whatever was going on and write about them in words and language that people could understand. There was no jargon, no abstraction. He just wrote it and was able to move people on that basis. He told me at one time that the main reason he was in the Socialist Workers' Party was to have an outlet for the things he wanted to write. He wanted the news to get out, and obviously the kind of things he wrote wouldn't be published in a major newspaper like the Daily News. This is February 1959. That's one of the articles on the FBI of the series. There were 10.
In the 1950s, Hoover was considered sacrosanct, a few steps above God, and everybody genuflected, and everybody was scared to death of J. Edgar Hoover and his shadow. And I just figured that being that J. Edgar Hoover was checking up on everybody, it'd be kind of interesting to check up on J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI.
And he went to Washington, D.C. and got a ticket to be tourist and be guided through the FBI, which I suppose after a while people got a little nervous about, that is the people who worked there. And he wrote this wonderful series of articles exposing the FBI for what it was, as being racist, as being anti-union, as being in league with strikebreakers, with the Klan, and so on. It was a great series. What motivated you to go down to Cuba? That is, I think at that time the SWP really took a dim view of the whole thing, and it must have been an undisciplined act on your part.
I don't think I asked anybody, as best I can remember.
Naturally, of course.
It was just, you know, there'd been a revolution in Cuba. I'd read some stuff about it, and I just wanted to figure, hey, you know, like to see for myself, see what's going on down there. And as soon as I got down there, like, I was immediately impressed.
He traveled throughout Cuba and watched people's reactions to what was being done. Everything changed. Everything was now in the context of what was good for the people, not what was good for the leader. Because people did see what was happening in Cuba, to some extent because of articles like Henry's, a whole generation of youth became radicalized. There was hope. If they could do it in Cuba, maybe we could do it also.
In the late 1960s, early 1970s, I was the volunteer editor of the Call for National Maritime Union Democracy. And the problem was that for 36 years, Joseph Kern was the one and only president of the Maritime Union. And he began to use the union as a trough to enrich himself and not take care of the needs of the merchant seamen. And it was an organization of an insurgent movement, and I became heavily involved in it. Jim Morrissey, who was a vocal opponent of the Joseph Kern machine, got his head cracked with lead pipes in front of the Union Hall while he was distributing material. And what this insurgent group did basically was demand the right of free elections, and that it's not a matter of democracy in the union for its own sake, but if you don't have democracy, then you can't have the interests of the seamen being represented by the union. Some of the lessons I learned through the Maritime Union campaign is that a multi-million-dollar apparatus can be challenged by a handful of people if the apparatus is out of sync with its membership. And the other things I learned is that in order to be effective, you've got to speak the language of the people you're working with.
Late in 1978, Henry came to me and said, I'd like to do a campaign. You know, the American Museum campaign had sort of wound down at that point in time, and so he was looking on to the next campaign. What did I suggest he should do? We spent some time together, and I suggested the Draize test.
We had heard about the Draize test, which is basically placing any kind of chemical in the eye of a rabbit to see how much damage it does to the eyes of this conscious rabbit. And this fellow Smythe in Britain from the Research Defense Society had suggested that this was a good test to find an alternative to. So we had support from within the science community already that an alternative would be possible. We scouted around and we figured that our best focus for this would be the cosmetics industry, which was using the Draize test. And in that connection, we could juxtapose the dream of beauty that they were fashioning with the reality nightmare of the rabbits. We wanted a sharp focus, and we figured that when people think of the cosmetics industry, first thing they think of is Revlon. Revlon is basically a symbol of the industry. And if you're the leader of the industry, you've got to set the course. Well, we sent a letter to Michel Bergerac, president of Revlon, and they pushed it off onto Frank Johnson, who was the director of public affairs. And we presented him with a paper about Revlon funding research to develop alternatives to the Draize rabbit eye test. And after a number of months of talking to the guy, of chatting to him, he still hadn't passed it on to his science advisors, in which case we figured that they weren't really being serious about it. The cosmetic industry is basically into marketing, and in order for us to fight the cosmetics industry, we needed to do it as well as they do. And we hooked up with Mark Graham, an advertising executive.
I had the feeling that even with this powerful coalition which Henry had put together, that one needed to communicate the bigness and the sophistication and all those things through an ad that looked like it was put out by a big organization.
I knew the stock was going down that day. But more importantly, I knew the company had a very significant problem that could cut not just to one-day stock price trading, but could cut to the core of the company. And in fact, if it weren't really well handled and so forth, it would have such a deleterious effect that it could theoretically wipe Revlon off the face of the counter in drugstores and department stores.
Most people believe that rabbits are voiceless. Wrong!
The demonstration featured a piece of street theater, and protesters dressed up in rabbit costumes brought along some live bunnies to help make their point. They want Revlon to stop using rabbits to test its products for eye irritancy. Henry SPIRA, a high school English teacher, organized the protest. He says he's pointing the finger at Revlon because they are the leaders in the industry.
Well, we're trying to tell Revlon that the people are not going to stand still for the blinding of Revlon, for the blinding of rabbits for the sake of another mascara, for the sake of another shampoo. And we're telling them that we want to, with a sense of urgency, want them to start developing immediately other non-animal methods for testing.
Revlon, stop! Stop! Torturing animals!
Well, I think that the thing that was interesting to me as a business reporter for Henry's handling of the Revlon campaign was that he was willing to take on a really big-name public target there. For most of the movement, that would have been a real unknown quantity and something that would have been very dangerous. Henry realized that it was a big institution that had interests, and if you could identify what those interests were and find some little area of overlap between their interests and your interests, you could actually accomplish something.